I was kneeling in absolute darkness, both hands pressed flat against a steel wall that wasn't supposed to exist. On the other side, two men were tearing apart a dead man's study with crowbars, hunting for the very thing I was clutching against my chest. A red leather ledger filled with names, numbers, and enough buried secrets to bring down half the city. My name is Elena Mercer. I'm 25 years old. 2 months ago, I couldn't afford a sandwich. Now I was hiding inside a sealed panic room behind a hollow wall, surrounded by vacuum-sealed bags stuffed with $100 bills, holding a letter from a father I thought had abandoned me 18 years ago. He didn't abandon me. He was murdered. And the man who killed him, the same man who evicted me from my apartment, who threw me onto the street with $14 in my pocket, who systematically dismantled my entire life piece by piece, was standing somewhere in this rotting mansion right now, directing his men to find me. He thought he'd buried me under poverty and desperation. He didn't realize he'd pushed me straight into the one place that held every dirty secret he'd spent 2 decades trying to destroy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the morning. Everything fell apart. I was kneeling in absolute darkness, both hands pressed flat against a steel wall that wasn't supposed to exist. On the other side, 2 men were tearing apart a dead man's study with crowbars, hunting for the very thing I was clutching against my chest. A red leather ledger filled with names, numbers, and enough buried secrets to bring down half the city. My name is Elena Mercer. I'm 25 years old. 2 months ago, I couldn't afford a sandwich. Now I was hiding inside a sealed panic room behind a hollow wall surrounded by vacuum-sealed bags stuffed with $100 bills, holding a letter from a father I thought had abandoned me 18 years ago. He didn't abandon me. He was murdered. And the man who killed him, the same man who evicted me from my apartment, who threw me onto the street with $14 in my pocket, who systematically dismantled my entire life piece by piece, was standing somewhere in this rotting mansion right now, directing his men to find me. He thought he'd buried me under poverty and desperation. He didn't realize he'd pushed me straight into the one place that held every dirty secret he'd spent 2 decades trying to destroy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the morning. Everything fell apart. At 25, society tells you that you should have at least some version of your life figured out. A career on some kind of upward trajectory, maybe a serious relationship, or at least the wreckage of one that taught you something. A savings account that doesn't make your stomach flip every time you open the app. Some evidence, any evidence, that the years between 18 and now were building towards something rather than just burning through time. I had none of those things. My name is Elena Mercer, and 3 months after my 25th birthday, my entire existence came apart at the seams. Not slowly, the way a sweater unravels if you pull one loose thread. No, it came apart all at once violently like a building brought down by controlled demolition. Every floor collapsing into the one beneath it, until there was nothing left but dust and rubble and silence. It started with my job. I was working as a junior graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing firm in Philadelphia called Whitmore Creative Partners. The firm was run by a man named Preston Delaney. Preston was the kind of boss who wore hand-stitched Italian loafers and monogrammed cufflinks, but who would send a company-wide email about excessive paper towel usage in the break room. He drove a pearl-white Porsche Cayenne. He parked it sideways across 2 spots in the garage every single morning, as if daring someone to say something about it. Nobody ever did. When Whitmore Creative lost its biggest client, a national restaurant chain that accounted for nearly 40% of the firm's annual revenue, Preston didn't take a salary reduction. He didn't sell the Porsche. He didn't downgrade from his corner office with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Rittenhouse Square. He laid off 22% of the staff. I was in the first wave, a Friday afternoon, 4:17 p.m. I remember the time because I glanced at my phone screen as Preston's executive assistant appeared at my desk with that tight, rehearsed smile that human resources people wear when they're about to ruin someone's life politely. She escorted me to a small conference room on the 3rd floor. No windows, gray carpet, a single box of tissues centered on the table, as if someone had calculated the exact midpoint for maximum accessibility during emotional collapse. Preston wasn't even in the room. He sent his HR director, a woman named Janet, who read from a printed script about restructuring and workforce optimization, and how this decision was in no way a reflection of my talent or dedication. She slid a manila envelope across the table containing my severance terms. 2 weeks' pay, a pamphlet about unemployment benefits, a reminder to return my key card. 22 minutes. That's how long it took to erase 2 years of my professional life. I walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box. Inside were a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a cactus in a terracotta pot that I'd somehow kept alive for 8 months, and a framed photograph. The photograph was the only thing that mattered. It showed my mother, Catherine Mercer, standing in a garden somewhere laughing at something off camera. She was wearing a yellow sundress. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked young and happy and completely unaware of everything that was coming. She died when I was 16, ovarian cancer. The kind they catch too late because the symptoms mimic a dozen other ordinary things until suddenly nothing about it is ordinary anymore. My father, Callum Mercer, left before the cancer, left before everything. He walked out of our lives when I was 7 years old. No warning, no argument that I could hear through the walls. Just a Tuesday morning where his side of the closet was empty and his drafting table in the basement had been stripped clean, and my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, staring at nothing. She never explained it. Not really. When I was old enough to push for answers, she'd say the same thing every time, her voice flat and rehearsed like Janet from HR, reading from a script she hadn't written. Your father made a choice, Elena, and his choice wasn't us. So I grew up believing my father was a coward, a man who designed buildings for a living but couldn't build a life sturdy enough to stand inside. I carried that belief like a stone in my chest. It shaped everything about me. I never asked for help. I never leaned on anyone. I would sooner sleep in a ditch than admit I couldn't handle something on my own because I had watched what happened when you depended on someone. They left. They always left. That stubbornness kept me alive for a while. And then it nearly killed me. After Preston's firm let me go, I did what every desperate person does in a collapsing economy. I scrambled. I rewrote my resume 14 times. I sent out applications by the dozens creative agencies, in-house design teams, startups that couldn't afford to pay well, but at least might give me a desk and a reason to set an alarm clock. I signed up for freelance platforms that turned creative work into a bidding war, racing other designers to the bottom of the pay scale. I designed a logo for a pet grooming company for $40. I built a full website layout for a real estate blog for $75. I skipped meals. I switched to store brand everything. I took my coffee black because cream was a luxury. But the cost of living in Philadelphia was a machine that never stopped feeding. Rent alone consumed over half of what I'd been earning when I was employed. Without that paycheck, the math turned predatory. Each month was a subtraction problem with no good answer, and the number at the bottom kept shrinking until it reached a figure that couldn't sustain a human life. Then came the eviction. My landlord was a man named Victor Hargrove. If you lived in the lower-income neighborhoods of Philadelphia, you knew that name the way you know the name of a disease. Hargrove owned properties across the city, apartment complexes, commercial buildings, row houses that he'd bought for nothing during the last housing crash and converted into overpriced rental units. He was a real estate mogul in the truest, coldest sense of the word. Tall, late 60s with silver hair combed back tight against his skull, and pale blue eyes that looked at people the way a butcher looks at hanging meat, calculating weight and value, nothing more. I had never spoken to him directly. Rent went through a property management company. Maintenance requests went into a digital void and were never answered. But when I fell 2 months behind on my rent, Victor Hargrove came to my door personally. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. A man who owned over 300 residential units across the city does not personally visit a tenant who owes $4,000. He has lawyers for that. He has process servers and property managers and automated systems that generate eviction notices with algorithmic indifference. But Victor Hargrove knocked on my door himself. A Wednesday evening, 6:15. He was wearing a dark overcoat charcoal suit underneath and a silk tie the color of dried blood. He smelled like sandalwood cologne and something sour beneath it, like old paper left in a damp room. I opened the door and he looked at me for a long moment before speaking. There was something in his expression that I couldn't identify at the time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the dismissive boredom of a landlord dealing with a delinquent tenant. It was something sharper, something almost like recognition. Miss Mercer, he said. Not a question, a confirmation. Mr. Hargrove, I know I'm behind. I started the words tumbling out in the desperate cadence of someone who has rehearsed a plea so many times, it's lost all meaning. I have interviews coming up. 2 of them. If I could just have another 30 days, I swear I'll... What is your full name? The question cut through my speech like a blade through thread. I'm sorry. Your full legal name, he repeated. His pale eyes hadn't blinked. Elena Catherine Mercer. Something happened in his face. A micro-expression. A twitch at the corner of his left eye, so small and so brief that I almost dismissed it as imagination. But I didn't imagine it. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, and then it was gone, smoothed over by a mask of professional indifference, so practiced it might as well have been carved from marble. This is a business, Elena, he said, and his voice was different now, colder, harder, like someone had flipped a switch inside his chest and turned off whatever residual humanity had been running in the background. Not a charity. You have 72 hours. He turned and walked down the hallway without another word. His leather shoes clicked against the linoleum with the measured rhythm of a metronome. I stood in the doorway and watched him go, and I felt something I couldn't explain, a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the hallway. He knew my name, not just my tenant name. He reacted to it, to Mercer. I didn't understand why. Not yet. 72 hours later, the sheriff's deputy arrived. It was raining because the universe has a sadistic sense of dramatic timing. I packed what I could fit into my 2008 Honda Civic, a car I'd bought used for $3,000 during my sophomore year of college. A car with a cracked dashboard and a passenger window that didn't roll down all the way, and 217,000 miles on the odometer. Into the back seat went 2 suitcases of clothes. Into the passenger seat went my laptop, a box of granola bars, and the framed photograph of my mother in the yellow sundress. Everything else, my bed, my bookshelf, the small kitchen table where I ate dinner alone every night, the entire physical architecture of the modest life I had built stayed behind. Property of Victor Hargrove. I sat in the driver's seat, rain hammering the roof, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I did not cry. I refused to cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had someone to hear them. For the first week I lived in the Honda. I parked in well-lit supermarket parking lots near the suburban edges of the city. Places where security cameras provided at least the illusion of safety. I kept the doors locked. I slept sitting up with a can of pepper spray in my right hand and my left hand resting on the door handle ready to bolt. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing broken every 20 minutes by the slam of a car door or the sweep of headlights across the windshield. I tried calling my best friend, Tamara Reed. Tamara and I had been close since college, the kind of friendship forged in late-night study sessions and shared hangovers, and the mutual understanding that neither of us had a safety net waiting beneath us. But Tamara had moved to Connecticut 3 months earlier to live with her fiancé in a tiny one-bedroom apartment. She was working double shifts as a veterinary technician, saving for a wedding she could barely afford. "God, Elena, I wish I could help," she said, her voice cracking over the phone. "If we had a bigger place, if I had any savings at all, you know I would." "I know," I told her. "I'll figure it out. I always do." I hung up and sat in the dark parking lot and stared at the glow of the supermarket sign until my eyes burned. I was entirely, completely alone. Then the last blow fell. The transmission on the Civic died on a Thursday morning, right in the middle of an intersection on Lancaster Avenue. The engine made a sound like a metal animal screaming. Then a violent shudder ran through the entire chassis, and the car simply stopped. Horns blared. A man in a pickup truck leaned out his window and called me something I won't repeat. I put the hazards on and pushed the car to the shoulder by myself, my sneakers sliding on the wet pavement, my arms shaking with the effort. The towing company took the Civic to an impound lot on the industrial edge of the city. The tow fee was $210. Storage was $45 per day. I had $14.32 in my checking account. They kept the car, and with it most of my clothes, the box of granola bars, and the last scraps of my former life. I was standing on a sidewalk in the rain with a duffel bag on one shoulder, a backpack on the other, and $14 between me and absolute zero. That's when I did something I hadn't done since the morning my mother told me my father was gone. I sat down on the curb, wrapped my arms around my knees, and I cried. I cried until I couldn't breathe, until the rain and the tears were indistinguishable, and my whole body shook with the force of it. I cried for the apartment, for the job, for the car, for my mother in her yellow sundress, for the father who left, for the 25 years I'd spent trying to outrun the feeling that I was destined to end up exactly here, nowhere, with nothing belonging to no one. And then I stopped. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I stood up, and I did what survivors do. I thought about my next move. It came to me like a memory surfacing from deep water. Not a plan exactly, more like an instinct, an image that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years, waiting for the moment when every other option had been exhausted. The Ashworth estate. It sat on the far western edge of the county past, where the streetlights ended and the suburban sprawl surrendered to dense, tangled woodland. A massive 3-story Victorian mansion that had been rotting quietly for over a decade, swallowed by ivy and neglect and the slow, patient hunger of time. Everyone in the area knew the story, or at least the version of it that had calcified into local legend. The house had belonged to Malcolm Ashworth, a reclusive millionaire who had made his fortune in real estate development during the 90s. Ashworth had been brilliant and strange, a man who threw lavish parties and then disappeared for months, who donated generously to the city's arts programs, but refused all interviews, who built a 3-story Victorian masterpiece on the edge of civilization, and then slowly withdrew from the world like a hermit retreating into his cave. He died in 2011. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest, but the circumstances were murky enough to fuel a decade of local speculation. No family came forward. No will was ever found. The property became tangled in a web of unpaid municipal taxes, competing liens, and legal red tape so dense that no lawyer wanted to wade through it. The house simply sat there, decaying, like a body that no one had claimed. Kids used to dare each other to break in. It was a rite of passage in the surrounding neighborhoods: sneak past the chain-link fence, touch the front door, run back screaming. But 4 years ago, a teenager had fallen through a rotted section of the second floor and broken his collarbone. After that, the police boarded up the windows, reinforced the fence, and posted trespassing signs every 10 feet. Everyone forgot about the Ashworth estate. Everyone except me. But I didn't go straight there, because before I left the impound lot, something happened that changed the trajectory of everything. When the tow company pulled my Civic onto their lot, they let me retrieve a few personal items from the interior before locking the gate. I grabbed my backpack. I grabbed the framed photo of my mother. And I grabbed the old suitcase, the one that had belonged to my mother, a battered hard-shell Samsonite from the 90s with a floral lining that smelled like her perfume even after all these years. I was sitting on the sidewalk afterward, repacking my duffel bag, trying to fit what little I had into the smallest possible configuration. The suitcase was too bulky to carry on foot, so I decided to transfer its contents into the duffel. I pulled out the clothes, the toiletries, the emergency phone charger. And then I felt something, a stiffness in the bottom of the suitcase. Not the hard shell, something between the floral fabric lining and the exterior wall. I'd carried this suitcase for years and never noticed it. But now, with my fingers pressing against the lining in just the right way, I felt a rectangular shape, roughly the size of an envelope sewn into the fabric. I tore the lining open with my fingernails. Inside was a sealed manila envelope yellowed with age. The adhesive had dried out years ago, so the flap came open easily. I reached inside and pulled out a single photograph. It was a 4x6 color print, faded but legible. It showed a man standing in front of a large Victorian house. The man was lean and tall, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, squinting into the sun with a half smile on his face. He was holding a set of rolled-up blueprints under one arm. I recognized him immediately, the shape of his jaw, the way he stood with his weight on his left foot, the way his hair fell across his forehead. It was my father, Callum Mercer, and the house behind him was the Ashworth estate. I flipped the photograph over. On the back, in my mother's careful slanted handwriting, were 2 lines. The first was a set of GPS coordinates. The second read, "If you have nothing left, go here. Your father prepared." The air left my lungs. My mother had known. She had known about the Ashworth house, known about whatever my father had been involved in, and she had hidden this photograph in the lining of her suitcase, like a message in a bottle sealed away for the day when the tide of disaster finally reached her daughter's window. How long had she known? Before he disappeared? After? Had she hidden this before the cancer took her, knowing that someday I might need it? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each one opening a door to a room full of more questions. But one thing was immediately urgently clear. My father hadn't just known about the Ashworth house. He had stood in front of it. He had held blueprints. He had been there as an architect, not a visitor. And my mother believed, even from beyond the grave, that whatever was waiting inside that house could save me. I walked 8 miles. It took me nearly 3 hours, most of it along the shoulder of the county road that led out of the suburbs and into the wooded darkness where the Ashworth property sat like a forgotten island. By the time I reached the rusted chain-link fence that surrounded the estate, the sun had dropped below the tree line, and the sky was a deepening bruise of purple and gray. The house loomed against the darkening horizon like something from a fever dream. 3 stories of Victorian architecture, once magnificent, now surrendered to entropy. Ivy crawled up the walls in thick, dark veins, swallowing entire sections of the peeling gray siding. The windows were either boarded over with warped plywood or shattered into jagged mouths of broken glass. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously in the middle, its railings snapped and hanging like broken ribs. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my jaw. Breaking and entering was a felony. I knew this. The rational part of my brain, the part that still clung to the belief that rules and systems and laws were things that protected people like me, was screaming at me to turn around, to find a shelter, to call a hotline, to do anything other than what I was about to do. But the survival part of my brain, the part that had been running the show for the past 2 weeks, the part that understood with absolute clarity that hypothermia kills faster than a criminal record, that part had already made the decision. I slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence where the metal had rusted and curled away from the post. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the jagged edge of the fencing caught my jacket and tore a 3-inch gash in the nylon. I found a cellar window at the back of the house where the plywood boarding had rotted through. The wood crumbled when I kicked it, falling inward in damp, spongy chunks that smelled like wet earth and decay. I fed my bags through the opening first, then squeezed my shoulders through the narrow gap and dropped into the darkness below. The basement was pitch black. The air was dense and heavy, saturated with the smell of mildew and something older. The accumulated silence of a place that hadn't been disturbed in years. I turned on my phone's flashlight. The beam cut a white tunnel through the dark illuminating piles of warped cardboard boxes, broken furniture, draped in cobwebs, and a thick carpet of dust that recorded my footprints like fresh snow. I climbed the creaking wooden stairs to the ground floor and stepped into a different century. The interior of the Ashworth house was a time capsule of faded wealth. Tarnished chandeliers hung from ceilings where the plaster had cracked and peeled in long curling strips, exposing the wooden lath beneath. A grand staircase curved upward from the central foyer, its mahogany banister thick with grime and draped in cobwebs that swayed in the faint drafts moving through the house. In the living room, furniture sat beneath white dust sheets that had turned a sickly yellow over the years, their shapes beneath the fabric like sleeping animals. It was terrifying. Every room felt occupied by absence, as if the house was holding its breath, watching me move through its corridors with the patient awareness of something that had been waiting a very long time. But it was dry. It was hidden. And it was shelter. I set up camp in what appeared to have been a small servant's quarters behind the kitchen, a narrow room with a low ceiling and a single window that had been bricked over from the outside. It was the most concealed space I could find, tucked away from the main windows, so that no one outside would see the faint glow of my flashlight. I pulled heavy velvet curtains from the dining room, dusty and moth-eaten, but still thick enough to provide insulation, and made a bed on the floor. I wrapped myself in my winter coat, used my duffel bag as a pillow, and lay down in the darkness. That first night, I did not sleep. Every sound the house made, every creak of settling timber, every gust of wind rattling the loose boards, every skitter of what I prayed were mice and not rats sounded like footsteps, like someone or something moving through the rooms above me. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling and felt the tears come again hot and fast, tracking lines through the grime on my cheeks. How did I get here? 25 years old, a squatter in a dead man's mansion, no job, no car, no family, $14, sleeping on curtains that smelled like 2011. But when the morning sun finally filtered through the cracks in the boards, casting thin golden lines across the dusty floorboards, like the bars of a cage made of light, I was still alive. I was still breathing. I had a roof and 4 walls and a place where no one would think to look for me. I was going to survive. I had decided. Survival in the Ashworth house became a strict punishing routine. Each morning, I would leave at dawn through the cellar window, walking 2 miles along the wooded road to reach the nearest public library. In the library's bathroom, I washed my face, brushed my teeth, and tried to make myself look like someone who still belonged to the world of the living. I charged my phone at the outlets near the reference section. I used their free Wi-Fi to send out job applications, scour Craigslist for gig work, and check my bank balance, which never changed because there was nothing left to change. For food, I bought the cheapest calories available: peanut butter, white bread, canned beans, instant oatmeal. I stretched every dollar until it screamed, supplementing my meager funds by collecting glass bottles and aluminum cans from the roadside ditches along my walking route and returning them for the deposit. 5 cents per can, 60 cents per bag, enough for a loaf of bread every 3 days. By nightfall, I would slip back through the fence and down into the cellar, an invisible ghost haunting a house that already had enough ghosts of its own. During the long, dark evenings, when the anxiety and the loneliness became a living thing coiling inside my chest, I explored. The Ashworth house was enormous. A labyrinth of long corridors, locked doors, forgotten rooms, and dead-end hallways that seemed designed to confuse. Despite the decay, you could see the bones of what it had been, a place built by a man of immense wealth and peculiar exacting taste. I found a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the books swollen and warped by years of dampness, their spines cracked and unreadable. I found a conservatory at the back of the house, a glass-roofed room that had once been filled with plants and was now choked with dead blackened vines that hung from the ceiling like the hair of drowned women. I found a music room with a grand piano whose keys had yellowed and warped until they looked like crooked teeth. And I found during the second week evidence that I was not the only person who still paid attention to this place. It was a Wednesday. I was returning from the library along my usual route when I saw a pickup truck parked on the gravel shoulder about 100 yards from the estate's fence line. An older man was standing at the front gate. He was heavy-set, mid to late 60s, wearing a canvas work jacket and a faded baseball cap. He was standing perfectly still, looking at the house with an expression I couldn't read from that distance. Then he bent down and placed something at the base of the gate. Flowers. A small bouquet of white carnations, the kind you buy at a gas station for $5. He stood there for another minute, head bowed, and then he walked back to his truck and drove away. I watched from the tree line, my heart thumping. Who was this man? Why was he leaving flowers at an abandoned estate like it was a grave? Over the next week, I saw him twice more, always in the late afternoon, always alone, always with the carnations. He never tried to enter the property. He just stood at the gate, paid his quiet respects, and left. I would later learn his name was Frank Novak, 68 years old, a retired plumber who lived in a single-wide trailer about a mile down the road. But at that moment, he was simply a mystery, one of many, that the Ashworth house seemed to generate the way old houses generate dust. It was the study that changed everything. Located at the end of a long, dark hallway on the ground floor, sealed behind heavy oak double doors that had swollen shut with moisture. The study resisted my entry for nearly 3 weeks. I tried the handles. I tried my shoulder. I tried wedging a broken chair leg into the gap between the doors and prying them apart. Nothing worked. On the 19th day of my occupation, I found a fire iron in the drawing room and used it as a lever. The doors groaned, cracked, and finally swung open, releasing a gust of trapped air that smelled like old paper and cold stone. The study was in surprisingly good condition compared to the rest of the house. The reason was immediately apparent. The windows had been bricked up from the outside at some point, sealing the room against weather, moisture, and light. It existed in a state of near-perfect preservation, a sealed chamber in the heart of a decaying body. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, intricately carved with leaf patterns along its edges, and an enormous stone fireplace with an ornate iron grate. Bookshelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes. An oil painting hung above the fireplace, a landscape of a coastal cliff at sunset, the colors darkened by age and grime, but still visible. I walked the perimeter of the room slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping across the shelves, the desk, the dust-furred rug. And as I walked, something began to bother me. Not something I could see, something I could feel. A spatial wrongness. My father, Callum Mercer, had been an architect. Before he vanished, before he became a ghost, and then a wound, and then a grudge I carried like a weapon, he had been a man who saw the world in dimensions and angles and load-bearing calculations. When I was small, 4, 5, 6 years old, he used to carry me on his shoulders through the streets of Philadelphia and point at buildings. "See that roofline, Elena? See how it sags on the left? That means the weight distribution is off. Somebody cut a corner somewhere. Look at that doorway. It's too narrow for the room it opens into. Bad proportions. Makes the whole building feel like it's frowning." I hated that I'd inherited his eye. Hated that even after everything, after the abandonment and the anger, and the years of telling myself I was nothing like him, I still automatically measured rooms, still instinctively noticed when a space didn't add up. And this room did not add up. The hallway outside the study was at least 30 feet long. I had paced it multiple times during my explorations, but the interior of the study from the oak doors to the back wall measured only about 20 feet. I didn't have a tape measure, but I had my stride, which I'd calibrated against the library's tile floor, at roughly 2.5 feet per step. 8 steps from the door to the back wall. 20 feet. There was a 10-foot gap of dead space between the back wall of the study and the adjacent drawing room. 10 feet of nothing. 10 feet of absence where there should have been structure. I stood in front of the back wall, the wall covered entirely by a massive built-in bookshelf that stretched from the hardwood floor to the 12-foot ceiling, and I felt it. Cold air. Not the general chill of an unheated house. This was different. A specific directional current, like standing near a cracked door on a winter night. I held my hand up, palm flat, and moved it slowly along the edge of the bookshelf, where the dark wood met the plaster wall. The draft was faint, but steady, a thin, invisible river of air moving through a gap that shouldn't have existed. My father built this room. The thought arrived fully formed, carrying the weight of certainty. My father, the architect. My father, in the photograph holding blueprints in front of this very house. He built this room, and he built something behind it. I spent the next 2 hours examining every inch of that bookshelf. I pulled at the rotting spines of leather-bound books, watching them disintegrate in my hands. I pressed knots in the wood. I knocked on panels, listening for the difference between solid and hollow. The sound changed near the center section, a subtle shift from a dense thud to a slightly more resonant thump, the acoustic signature of empty space. I was close. I began pulling books from the center shelves, more carefully examining not just the spines, but the spaces behind them. Most of the volumes were genuine, bloated with moisture, their pages fused into solid bricks of pulp. But on the third shelf from the top near the center, my hand closed around a book that was different. It was heavier than it should have been, denser. And when I pulled it forward, it didn't slide out the way a book should. It tilted like a lever. The volume was labeled on its spine in faded gold lettering. Ashworth Encyclopedia, Volume 4, Botany to Ceramics. But when I pulled it fully open on its hidden hinge, I saw that it wasn't a book at all. The interior had been hollowed out and replaced with a wooden box containing a single object, a brass lever, small, heavy, cold to the touch. I held my breath. 18 years of believing my father was a coward. 18 years of building my identity on the foundation of his absence. 18 years of telling myself that I owed him nothing, that he had given me nothing, that the only thing Callum Mercer had left behind was a hole in the shape of a man. And here I was, standing in a room he had designed, about to pull a lever he had hidden inside a house my dead mother had sent me to. I pulled the lever down. A metallic clack echoed through the silent house, sharp and sudden enough to make me flinch. Then came a grinding sound, the protest of gears that hadn't moved in over a decade, fighting against rust and calcified grease and the stubborn resistance of time. Slowly, agonizingly, the central section of the bookshelf began to swing outward on hidden hinges. The movement kicked up a massive cloud of dust that billowed into the study like smoke from a dry fire. I stumbled backward, coughing, waving the dust away from my face, my eyes watering. When the air cleared, I raised my flashlight and aimed the beam into the opening. What I saw made every nerve in my body go still. It was not a closet. It was not a storage space. It was not a safe room, or at least not only a safe room. It was a command center. The space beyond the bookshelf was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, entirely encased in reinforced steel plate and poured concrete. The air inside was hermetically stale, sealed so tightly that the atmosphere had preserved everything within it in a state of suspended animation. No moisture, no mildew, no decay. Just cold, dry, dead air that smelled like old paper and ozone and something faintly metallic. In the center of the room sat a metal desk with an ancient boxy computer monitor and a keyboard coated in a fine layer of undisturbed dust. Against the right wall was a narrow military-style cot with a folded wool blanket. Against the left wall, a row of metal filing cabinets. But it was the back wall that stopped my breath in my throat. The entire back wall was covered, not with shelves, not with storage, with evidence. It was a crime board, the kind you see in detective movies and true crime documentaries. Photographs pinned to the wall with colored push pins connected by lengths of red string and blue string and yellow string that formed a web of relationships and transactions and accusations. There were newspaper clippings, photocopied documents, hand-drawn diagrams, and sticky notes covered in small, precise handwriting. At the center of the web, pinned with a single red pushpin, was a large photograph of a man I didn't recognize. Silver-haired, cold-eyed, expensive suit. Beneath the photograph, someone had written in black marker, Victor Hargrove Primary, my landlord, the man who had evicted me, the man who had stood in my doorway and asked my full name and twitched when I said Mercer. He was at the center of this, whatever this was. My eyes moved across the web of strings and photographs, following the connections, reading the labels. Judges, city councilmen, developers, shell companies, dollar amounts that made my head swim. And then, in the lower right corner of the board, connected to Hargrove's photograph by a single red string, I found another picture. A man, lean, tall, flannel shirt, standing on a construction site with blueprints under his arm. My father. Beneath his photograph, circled in red marker, were 3 words and a date that made the room tilt beneath my feet. Silenced March 2008. Next to the photograph, mounted on a heavy-duty metal shelf along the right side of the room, were rows of clear, vacuum-sealed bags. I walked toward them, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Through the thick plastic, I could see the contents clearly. Stacks of $100 bills, dozens of bags, hundreds of stacks. And on the metal desk, positioned with deliberate precision at the center of the blotter, sat 2 objects. A thick, red, leather-bound ledger, and a small brass key resting on top of a locked steel box. I stood in the center of that sealed room, 10 feet beneath reality, and I understood with total, devastating clarity that everything I had ever believed about my father, about my life, about the random cruelty of the universe that had stripped me of everything I had, all of it was wrong. None of it was random. None of it was accident. And the dead man's house that I had broken into out of sheer blind desperation was not just a shelter. It was a weapon, one that my father had built for me 18 years ago and hidden behind a hollow wall and waited with the infinite patience of the dead for me to find. I don't know how long I stood there. Time operates differently underground in sealed rooms, in places where the air hasn't moved in over a decade, and the silence is so total, it becomes a sound of its own. a low, steady hum that presses against your eardrums like deep water. It could have been 2 minutes. It could have been 20. I stood in the center of that steel-encased chamber and stared at my father's photograph on the wall and felt the tectonic plates of my entire identity shift beneath my feet. Silenced. March 2008. Not left, not abandoned, not chose someone else over his family. Silenced. My flashlight hand had stopped trembling. That was the strange thing. In the moment of the most destabilizing revelation of my life, my body went completely still, as if some deep mammalian circuit had recognized that panic was a luxury I could not afford and had shut it down at the source. My breathing was slow. My vision was sharp. I was operating on something beyond adrenaline, some cold, ancient fuel that burns in the chest of every creature that has ever found itself trapped in a small space with a predator nearby. I wasn't trapped yet, but I was standing in the den of a predator's secrets, and the predator was still alive, still powerful, still out there in the city above me, wearing bespoke suits and collecting rent checks and sleeping soundly in the certainty that his past was buried. I moved to the metal desk. The red leather ledger sat in the center of the blotter, with the kind of deliberate placement that suggested ritual. Someone had positioned it there with care, knowing it would be found, knowing it mattered. The leather was cracked with age, but still deeply red, the color of arterial blood. A thin leather strap with a tarnished brass clasp held it shut. I unclasped it. I opened the cover, and I began to read. The pages were filled with handwriting that I would later confirm belonged to Malcolm Ashworth. It was small, precise, and obsessively organized, the penmanship of a man who understood that details were the difference between a case that stuck and one that fell apart. Each page was formatted like an accountant's worksheet, divided into neat columns with headers written in block capitals. Date, payer, recipient, amount, purpose, evidence ref. The entries began 20 years ago and spanned nearly a decade. As I turned the pages, a picture emerged, not all at once, but in accumulating layers, the way a photograph develops in a dark room. Shadows first, then shapes, then details so sharp they cut. Victor Hargrove had not built his real estate empire through shrewd investment and hard work. He had built it through systematic corruption on a scale that made my stomach turn. The ledger documented bribe after bribe after bribe. Payments to city zoning officials to reclassify residential neighborhoods as commercial development zones, clearing the way for Hargrove to buy properties at rock-bottom prices from displaced residents who had no legal recourse. Payments to building inspectors to overlook code violations in Hargrove's low-income rental properties, the same properties where families lived with faulty wiring and lead paint and heating systems that broke every winter. Payments to judges, 3 of them by name, with dollar amounts and dates and case numbers corresponding to lawsuits that Hargrove had won against tenants who tried to fight back. Every ruling, every dismissed complaint, every denied injunction purchased in advance, the outcome written before the gavel ever fell. Payments to the former mayor's office. Not the mayor directly, but his chief of staff, a man named Alderman, who had served as the intermediary for a series of land deals that transferred publicly owned parcels to Hargrove's shell companies for a fraction of their assessed value. And at the center of all of it, serving as the financial engine that made the machine run, was Malcolm Ashworth himself. Ashworth had been the shadow banker, the launderer, the man who took Hargrove's dirty money and cycled it through a network of offshore accounts and shell corporations until it came out clean on the other side, ready to be reinvested in the next scheme. But something had changed. I could see it in the ledger, in the way the entries shifted over time. The early pages were clinical, detached, the bookkeeping of a man who was documenting transactions, not judging them. But as the years progressed, the handwriting grew tighter. Notes appeared in the margins. Question marks, exclamation points, underlined passages. The tone shifted from record-keeping to accusation. On a page dated 14 years before the present, Ashworth had written in the margin in handwriting that was noticeably more agitated than the precise columns beside it. Hargrove expanding into District 7. Residents will be displaced. Hundreds of families. He doesn't care. He never cared. And 3 pages later, Callum agrees. We have to stop this. Collecting evidence. Building the case. If we go to the feds, we need everything. Every name, every dollar, every date. No gaps. Callum. My father's name written in the hand of a dead man in a ledger hidden behind a wall that my father had designed. I turned the pages faster now, scanning the columns, searching for his name. I found it in several entries, but not where I expected. Callum Mercer was not listed as a bribe recipient. He was listed under a different column that Ashworth had added later labeled Assets Coerced. The entry read, Callum Mercer, architect, recruited by Hargrove 2001. Designed concealed spaces in Hargrove properties for document storage and cash holding. Initially compliant. Turned cooperative witness 2007. Currently assisting with evidence compilation. High risk. My father had been one of them. He had worked for Hargrove, designing hidden rooms and false walls in properties used by the corruption ring. But at some point, he had turned. He had become Ashworth's ally, helping to build the very case that this ledger represented. And then, on the next page, the entry that made the air leave my lungs. It was dated March 2008. The column labeled Purpose contained a single word that Ashworth had written so forcefully the pen had nearly torn through the paper. Elimination. The entry documented a payment of $45,000 from Hargrove to a private security contractor whose name I didn't recognize. The description read, Contract for permanent removal of C. Mercer. Mercer informed Ashworth of intention to approach federal authorities independently. Hargrove deemed this unacceptable risk. Order given March 3rd. Mercer last seen March 7th. March 7th, 2008. 4 days after someone decided my father needed to die. And the same week, My mother told 7-year-old me that Daddy had made a choice, and his choice wasn't us. I closed the ledger. I pressed both hands flat against its leather cover, and I closed my eyes and I breathed. And for a moment, the only thing that existed in the entire universe was the pressure of my palms against the cracked red surface and the sound of my own heartbeat, which had become so loud it seemed to fill the steel room like a drum. My father did not leave us. My father was killed for trying to do the right thing. And the man who ordered his death was the same man who had stood in my doorway 6 weeks ago and told me that business was not a charity. The same man who had looked at my face and heard my name and twitched because he recognized it, because he knew exactly whose daughter I was. I opened the ledger again. I was not done. The remaining pages documented Ashworth's continued efforts after my father's death. Alone now without his ally, Ashworth had spent the next 3 years from 2008 to 2011 methodically building the case by himself. The entries became more detailed, more desperate. He was gathering financial records, making copies of wire transfers, tracking shell company registrations across multiple states. The murder board on the wall behind me was the physical manifestation of this obsession. Years of work pinned and strung together in a web that connected Hargrove to every corrupt official in the city. But Ashworth never finished. The final entry in the ledger was dated June 2011. It was only 2 lines. Hargrove knows I've been documenting, Ruth told him. And below that, in handwriting that was almost illegible, as if written in great haste or great fear, if I don't survive, the room holds everything. Callum built it to last. The truth is in the walls. Ruth. I scanned backward through the ledger looking for the name. I found it on a page from 3 years earlier. Ruth Ashworth, Malcolm's ex-wife. They had separated years before, and according to a margin note, Ruth had maintained a relationship with Hargrove, a relationship that Ashworth described as transactional and dangerous. Ruth had betrayed him. She had told Hargrove about the evidence, and Hargrove had done what Hargrove always did when someone threatened his empire. Malcolm Ashworth's official cause of death was cardiac arrest. But the ledger painted a different picture. A man in perfect health who had been systematically collecting evidence against a murderer whose ex-wife was sleeping with that murderer, who died suddenly of heart failure 6 days after writing Hargrove Knows. 2 men, my father and his closest friend, both killed by the same man. Both buried not in graves, but in silence, their deaths disguised as abandonment and natural causes, their stories rewritten by the people who destroyed them. I set the ledger down and turned to the locked steel box. The small brass key sat on top of it as if placed there by someone who wanted to make sure the box would be opened by whoever found the room. The key was cold in my fingers. I slid it into the lock, turned it, and the box opened with a soft, precise click. Inside was a single sealed envelope yellowed with age. The paper was heavy, the kind of stationery that architects and engineers used for formal correspondence. Written across the front in handwriting that I recognized from a place so deep inside me, it predated conscious memory, were 3 words. To my Elena. My father's handwriting. I had not seen it since I was 7 years old, but I knew it the way you know the sound of a voice you haven't heard in 2 decades. Not with your mind, but with your body. With the part of you that remembers before language, before logic, before the stories you told yourself to make the absence bearable. I pressed the envelope against my chest, and I felt something crack open inside me. Something I had spent 18 years sealing shut with anger and pride and the stubborn, self-destructive conviction that I did not need a father and never had. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered on both sides with my father's handwriting. The letter was dated March 5th, 2008, 2 days before he disappeared. Elena, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have somehow found your way to the one place I prayed you would never need to come. I am so sorry, sweetheart. I need you to know that first before anything else. I am sorry for every birthday I missed, every school play, every scraped knee I wasn't there to bandage, every night you went to sleep thinking your father didn't love you enough to stay. That thought must have been a knife in your chest, and I am the one who put it there, and I will carry that guilt into whatever comes after this life. But I need you to know the truth. I didn't leave you and your mother because I wanted to. I didn't leave at all. I was taken. Malcolm Ashworth and I met on the first day of architecture school at Carnegie Mellon. We were 18 years old, both from families that couldn't afford the tuition, both running on scholarships and stubbornness and the naive belief that you could build a better world, one structure at a time. Malcolm was the most brilliant person I ever knew, and he was my closest friend for 20 years. After graduation, we were recruited by a development firm connected to Victor Hargrove. The money was extraordinary. The work was exciting. And by the time we understood what we were really building hidden rooms for cash storage, false walls in properties used for money laundering, architectural obfuscation, designed to deceive building inspectors and federal auditors, we were already in too deep to walk away. I tried Elena. When Hargrove began planning to burn buildings in the low-income housing districts to force cheap property sales, I told Malcolm I was going to the authorities. Malcolm begged me to wait. He said we needed more evidence, more documentation, a case so airtight that Hargrove couldn't buy or threaten his way out of it. He was right about the strategy. But I was right about the urgency, because Hargrove found out before we were ready. They are going to kill me, Elena. I know this the way you know the weather is about to turn a pressure change in the air. A stillness that means something terrible is gathering on the horizon. Hargrove's people have been following me. My phone clicks when I make calls. A car I don't recognize has been parked across the street from our house for 3 days. I can't go to the police. Hargrove owns them. I can't go to the FBI. There isn't time, and I don't have enough evidence on my own. Malcolm is still building the case, but he needs years, not days. So I am doing the only thing I can do. I am writing this letter. I am sealing it in this room. A room I designed off Hargrove's grid. A room that doesn't appear on any blueprint he has ever seen. A room that only I know how to build, and only someone with my eye for dimensions would ever think to look for. The money on these shelves is dirty. It is cash I skimmed from Hargrove's operations over the years. Insurance I was accumulating in case I needed to run. I never got the chance to run. So now it belongs to you. It is the only inheritance I can leave you, and I know it is stained, and I am sorry for that too. Take the money. Take Malcolm's ledger. And when you are ready, when you are safe and strong and certain, destroy them. Destroy Hargrove. Destroy every man whose name appears in that book. Your mother knows about this house. I told her everything before I realized how dangerous that knowledge was. She will hide the information somewhere safe. Somewhere only you will find it when the time is right. Trust her, even after she's gone. She loved you more than I have words to describe. I have to go now. It's getting dark and I can see the car outside again. I love you, Elena. I have loved you since the moment you were born, and I have never not for a single second of a single day stopped. Your father, Callum. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear hit the paper, darkening a small circle on the yellowed surface, and I pulled the letter away from my face, instinctively terrified of damaging it. This piece of paper that had waited 18 years in a steel box behind a hidden wall for a girl who might never come. But I came, broke homeless, desperate and furious at a man who deserved none of my fury. I came because my mother had hidden a photograph in the lining of a suitcase, and my father had hidden a room behind a bookshelf, and between the two of them, dead and gone, they had built a path that led me here. To the truth, to the money, to the weapon that could bring down the man who had destroyed my family. I sat on the metal cot in that sealed room, and I held the letter against my chest, and I grieved. Not the sharp, angry grief I had carried for 18 years, the grief of abandonment, of rejection, of a daughter who believed her father didn't want her. That grief had been a blade, and I had used it to cut away any part of myself that was soft enough to be hurt. This grief was different. It was the grief of understanding, the grief of learning that the person you hated was actually the person who loved you most, and that the hatred you carried like armor was actually a wound you had been inflicting on yourself over and over for nearly 2 decades. My father was not a coward. My father
was the bravest man I would ever know, and he died for it.
I allowed myself 10 minutes. 10 minutes to sit in the dark and cry and feel the full, devastating weight of what I had lost. Then I wiped my face, folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and stood up. Because grief was a luxury and I had work to do, I began with the money. I counted the vacuum-sealed bags on the shelves. 37 bags each containing bundled stacks of $100 bills. Without opening and counting every stack, I estimated the total at somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000. My father had been skimming from Hargrove's cash flow for years, stashing it in the one place Hargrove would never find a room designed by the very architect Hargrove had ordered killed, hidden behind a wall in a house that belonged to the friend who had died trying to finish the job my father started. The irony was so sharp it could draw blood. I turned to the computer. The monitor was an old CRT model, thick and boxy, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in over a decade. The tower beneath the desk was coated in dust, but appeared intact. I found the power button and pressed it, expecting nothing. The machine hummed. A green light blinked on the front panel. The monitor flickered, buzzed, and then glowed to life with a pale blue light that filled the room like dawn breaking underground. The operating system that loaded was ancient, a version of Windows so old it looked like a museum exhibit. But it loaded. The hard drive clicked and whirred, and after a long 30 seconds, a desktop appeared. There were dozens of folders. Most had names that were strings of numbers and dates, file naming conventions that suggested systematic organization. I didn't have time to open them all. My phone was at 19% battery, and the computer's own power running on what I assumed was an uninterruptible power supply that my father had installed could die at any moment after 15 years of dormancy. But one folder caught my eye. It was labeled simply, "Listen," and it sat alone in the center of the desktop, separated from the others as if placed there deliberately. I opened it. Inside was a single audio file. I double-clicked. The computer's tiny internal speaker crackled to life. The recording was rough, full of static and background noise, the ambient sound of an office or a restaurant somewhere with hard surfaces and distant conversation. But two voices were clear enough to understand. The first voice was deep measured and controlled. It spoke with the cadence of a man accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. "The Mercer situation needs to be resolved this week. He's talking to Ashworth about going to the feds. If that happens, we lose everything: the zoning deals, the Riverside project, the offshore accounts. Everything." The second voice was different, higher, sharper, with an edge of irritation. "And you want me to authorize that? You understand what you're asking?" "I understand exactly what I'm asking. Mercer is a liability. He has been for months. He designed half our infrastructure. He knows where everything is hidden. If he flips, he can draw the FBI a map." A pause. The sound of ice clinking in a glass. "Do it, but make it clean. No investigation, no body. He just disappears. The wife will assume he left. People leave their families every day." And Ashworth? Malcolm is manageable for now. He's a coward at heart. Without Mercer pushing him, he'll keep his mouth shut. The recording ended. I sat in the blue glow of the ancient monitor, and I could not move, could not breathe. The first voice, the one giving the order, the one who had spoken of my father as a liability to be resolved, a situation to be handled, was unmistakably Victor Hargrove. I had heard that voice in my doorway 6 weeks ago. I would know it anywhere. The second voice, the one who had authorized the killing with the casualness of someone approving a landscaping contract, I did not recognize. But Ashworth's ledger would tell me. Everything was in the ledger. It was at this moment, sitting in the electric blue light of a dead man's secret bunker, holding a dead father's letter, listening to the recorded voice of the man who had ordered his murder, that I heard the sound. Glass breaking. Distant, muffled by layers of wall and floor and ceiling, but unmistakable. The sharp, brittle crash of a window being smashed in somewhere on the floor above me. Then, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, the sound of work boots on hardwood. Not one set, two. My body went cold. I killed the computer monitor. The blue light vanished, plunging the room back into absolute darkness. I grabbed my phone, cupped my hand over the screen to contain its glow, and listened. The footsteps moved across the second floor directly above the study. Floorboards creaked and groaned under the weight. Then a voice, deep grating and sharp with impatience, carried through the old house's ventilation system with startling clarity. "Check the floorboards in the master. Pendleton was paranoid. He wouldn't have just buried it in the yard. It's in the walls somewhere." A second voice, rougher, less refined. "Whole place is a death trap, Frost. Floor's half rotted through up here." "Just do your job, Kovac." Frost. Kovac. I didn't know the names, but I knew the voice that had just given the order because it carried the unmistakable tone of a man who was accustomed to operating in the space between corporate authority and criminal enforcement, calm on the surface, with an undercurrent of violence held in reserve. And I knew with a certainty that turned my blood to ice who had sent them. Victor Hargrove was looking for the ledger. Of course he was. The demolition was scheduled for tomorrow morning. That detail hadn't been in the ledger, but the logic was immediate and clear. Hargrove was finally destroying the Ashworth estate, flattening it, erasing the last physical evidence of Malcolm Ashworth's existence, and with it, any secrets the house might contain. But he couldn't authorize the demolition until he was certain the ledger had been found and destroyed. If a construction worker pulled a red leather book from the rubble and opened it out of curiosity, Hargrove's empire would collapse in a matter of days. So he had sent his men in first. One last sweep before the bulldozers arrived at dawn. And they were here, in the house, right now, with me. The footsteps moved from the second floor to the first. I tracked them by sound, the heavy thud of boots descending the grand staircase, the creak of the foyer floorboards. the groan of doors being forced open down the hallway. They were searching room by room. They were getting closer. I looked at the bookshelf door, still swung wide open into the study. The gaping black rectangle of the hidden entrance was visible from the study doorway. If Frost or Kovac walked into the study and shined a flashlight at the back wall, they would see it immediately. A hole in the wall where a bookshelf should be. A neon sign pointing directly to me and everything I was holding. I had to close the door. I moved in the darkness, feeling my way along the rough steel wall with my fingertips. My father had designed this room. My father, who thought about structural details the way other people thought about breathing. He would have built an interior mechanism, a way to seal the room from the inside. My fingers found it. A heavy iron wheel mounted on a steel plate beside the doorframe. It was the size of a dinner plate with 6 spokes radiating from a central hub, a submarine-style locking mechanism. I gripped the wheel with both hands and turned. It resisted. 15 years of disuse had welded the mechanism in place with a thin shell of oxidation. I braced my feet against the floor and put my entire body into it, pulling with my arms and pushing with my legs, feeling the tendons in my forearms strained to the point of tearing. The wheel broke free with a metallic shriek that sounded in the silence of that sealed room like a scream. I froze. My heart stopped. On the other side of the wall, the footsteps in the hallway stopped too. For 5 seconds, the house was completely silent. Then the footsteps resumed faster now, coming toward the study. I cranked the wheel. The mechanism groaned and protested each rotation, producing a sound that I was certain could be heard throughout the entire house. But the bookshelf was moving, swinging closed inch by agonizing inch, the gap narrowing, the faint gray light from the study shrinking to a sliver. The study doors burst open. I heard them slam against the interior walls with a crash that echoed through the ventilation. The bookshelf clicked shut. Total darkness. Total silence except for my own breathing, which I smothered immediately by pressing both hands over my mouth and nose. Through the steel wall, muffled but comprehensible, I heard them.
Frost, look at this. Someone's been in here.
Kovac's rough voice tight with surprise. The shuffle of boots on the study floor. The sweep of a flashlight beam visible as a faint line of light that leaked through microscopic gaps in the bookshelf's frame. The dust is disturbed. Frost said, his voice closer now. He was at the bookshelf. He was feet away from me, separated by 4 inches of steel and wood, and the thin membrane of concealment that my father had engineered 18 years ago. Someone was standing right here, recently. Look at the footprints. My heart was hammering so hard, I was certain they could hear it. I pressed my back against the far wall of the room, as far from the door as I could get, and I did not breathe.
These books have been pulled off the shelves,
Kovac said. I heard the thud of volumes hitting the floor. They were clearing the shelves, searching for the same mechanism I had found. Someone's already been through this room. Call Hargrove, Frost said. His voice had gone flat and hard, the professional calm of a man who dealt in problems and solutions. Tell him someone's been in the house. Someone found the study. The beep of a phone. A pause. Then Kovac's voice, lower now, reporting to someone on the other end. Mr. Hargrove, it's Kovac. We're in the ground floor study. Someone's been here. Dust is disturbed, books are pulled off the shelves. Looks recent. Could be a squatter. A pause. Kovac listening. Yes, sir. The demolition crew is still set for 6 a.m., but if someone's been in here and found something before we did. Another pause. Longer this time. Understood. We'll tear it apart. The sounds of systematic destruction began. Furniture overturned. Books swept off shelves in heavy cascading thuds. The sharp crack of wood panels being pried loose with crowbars. They were dismantling the study piece by piece, searching for the hidden room whose door I had sealed from the inside. I sat on the metal cot, my whole body trembling. My arms wrapped around the duffel bag that held everything I owned in the world, and I listened to two men tear apart the room on the other side of the wall. Then Frost said the words that turned my blood to ice water. This wall is wrong. A pause. The sound of knocking a fist against wood, then against the steel plate behind it. The hollow, resonant thud of someone striking a surface that has empty space behind it. The dimensions don't add up, Frost continued, his voice rising with certainty. There's dead space here, at least 8-10 feet. Something's behind this bookshelf. A heavy pound against the wall, hard enough that I felt the vibration through the steel. Then another. I can't break through this, Frost said. It's reinforced. Steel, maybe concrete behind the paneling? Sledgehammer, Kovac said. In the truck. Go get it. You want a sledgehammer through a steel wall. I want to find what's behind it. Go. Footsteps. Kovac leaving the study, his boots heavy and quick down the hallway. The front door opened and slammed shut. The sound of his footsteps crunching on gravel outside, heading for the truck. Frost stayed. I could hear him breathing on the other side of the wall, slow and steady, the breath of a patient man who was used to waiting. I had minutes, maybe 5, maybe less. I moved. In the darkness, operating entirely by touch, I dumped the contents of my duffel bag onto the floor-clothes toiletries, the few possessions I had carried through my weeks of homelessness. I unzipped the vacuum-sealed bags of cash, wincing at the sharp plastic ripping sound, and began stuffing stacks of $100 bills into the duffel. Each stack was dense and heavy. The bag filled fast. I switched to my backpack, cramming the red ledger and First Spine against my laptop, then filling every remaining pocket and space with more cash. I couldn't take it all. The weight was already staggering. I estimated I had packed somewhere around $400,000 between the two bags, leaving perhaps $100,000 still on the shelves. I grabbed the envelope with my father's letter and shoved it into the inside pocket of my jacket, zipped it against my chest. From outside the house, the slam of a truck door. Footsteps returning. The metallic clang of a sledgehammer being carried. I went to the iron wheel and gripped it. This was the gamble. The bookshelf door was the only way out. When I opened it, I would be stepping directly into the study. If Frost was standing at the bookshelf, I would be face to face with him carrying 2 bags full of stolen cash and evidence that could put his employer in prison for life. But Kovac had just returned with the sledgehammer. That meant both men were likely in or near the study. I needed a distraction, a gap, a moment where the space between the door and the exit was clear. I heard Kovac enter the study, breathing hard from the exertion of carrying the heavy tool. "Give it here," Frost said. "Where do you want to hit?" "Center of the bookshelf, right here. There's a seam." The sound of the sledgehammer being positioned. A grunt of effort. Then a massive, deafening impact against the wall. The steel behind the wood absorbed most of the force, but the sound was catastrophic. A thunderclap of metal on metal that reverberated through the panic room like a bomb detonation. Another impact. Another. The wood paneling on the study side was splintering, but the steel plate beneath it was holding. My father had built this room to withstand exactly this kind of assault. But steel has limits, and 2 determined men with a sledgehammer had time and fury on their side. "Again," Frost ordered. "Harder." Another impact. I felt the wall shudder. A hairline crack appeared in the ceiling where the concrete met the steel frame. Dust rained down. I couldn't wait. Every second I spent in this room brought them closer to breaking through. And once they were inside, there would be no explanation that could save me. A homeless woman hiding behind a hidden wall with $400,000 in cash and a ledger full of evidence against the most powerful man in the city. They wouldn't call the police. They would call Hargrove. And Hargrove would do what he had done to my father and Malcolm Ashworth. I waited for the next sledgehammer swing. The moment it connected, the deafening crash of steel on steel filling the room like an explosion. I turned the iron wheel. The mechanism ground open. The bookshelf began to swing. I pushed it hard, throwing my weight against the heavy door, and it swung outward into the study with a speed that caught me off guard. The room was lit by the beams of 2 high-powered flashlights that swept toward me like searchlights. But Frost and Kovac were positioned at the center of the bookshelf, not the edge. Kovac had the sledgehammer reared back for another swing. Frost was standing beside him, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other. The opening of the bookshelf door was at the far left, 3 feet from where they stood, and in the fraction of a second, it took for their brains to register that the wall was moving. I was already through. I did not look at their faces. I heard Frost's sharp intake of breath, the start of a shout that hadn't fully formed. I was running. The study doors were open. The hallway beyond was dark. I sprinted through it, the duffel bag slamming against my right hip, the backpack straps cutting into my shoulders. Behind me, Frost's voice erupted. "Stop, Kovac, move!" The crash of the sledgehammer being dropped. The thunder of boots on hard wood. I didn't go for the front door. They had come in through the front. Their truck was parked out front. The front was a dead end. Instead, I cut left at the end of the hallway through the dining room with its sheet-draped table and into the conservatory. The conservatory was a glass-roofed room at the back of the house, its walls lined with the skeletal remains of dead plants and the blackened, twisted vines that hung from the rusted iron framework like the rigging of a ghost ship. At the far end was a wooden door that led to the rear grounds. I had mapped this exit during my second week in the house back when escape routes were a theoretical exercise rather than an immediate necessity. I hit the door with my shoulder at full sprint. The wood was rotted soft, and it gave way with a splintering crack, the frame disintegrating around me as I burst through into the night. The rain hit me like a wall. Cold, driving, relentless, the kind of October rain that strips the heat from your body in minutes. The rear grounds of the Ashworth estate were an overgrown wasteland of dead gardens and collapsed outbuildings, and beyond them, the tree line, the edge of the dense, sprawling woods that stretched for miles to the west. I ran for the trees. Behind me, through the shattered conservatory door, I heard Frost's voice sharp and furious.
Around back. She went through the conservatory.
The beam of a flashlight swept across the yard, catching the rain in a cone of silver light. I was already at the tree line, plunging into the underbrush branches, whipping across my face and catching at my jacket. And then I was in the woods, my woods. The woods I had walked through every day for 3 weeks, scavenging for bottles, mapping the trails, learning the terrain with the unconscious thoroughness of an animal marking its territory. I knew every ditch, every deer trail, every fallen tree and dry creek bed. They did not. I ran until the flashlight beams behind me were nothing but distant pinpricks, swallowed by the rain and the trees. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were filled with wet sand. I ran until the sounds of pursuit faded into the white noise of rain on leaves and my own ragged, desperate breathing. Then I stopped. I was standing in a shallow ravine, knee-deep in dead leaves and cold rainwater somewhere deep in the woods. The darkness was total. I couldn't see my own hands. I leaned against a tree and slid down the trunk until I was sitting in the mud and the water my bags clutched against my chest, and I shook. Not from cold, from everything. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the rain to ease from a downpour to a steady drizzle, long enough for the sky to begin its slow transition from black to the deep bruised gray that precedes dawn. And then I stood up and I walked. I knew where I was going, not to a diner, not to a bus station, not yet. First, I needed something I had never allowed myself to need: help. Frank Novak's trailer sat about a mile east of the Ashworth estate on a gravel access road that ran parallel to the county highway. I had noted its location during my second week, the way you note the position of a life raft when you're standing on the deck of a ship you're not sure will stay afloat. The trailer was a single-wide pale blue with rust streaks along the seams, parked on a concrete pad surrounded by neat rows of firewood and a small, well-tended vegetable garden enclosed by chicken wire. A light was on inside, the amber glow of a kitchen window warm against the gray dawn. I stood at the edge of the gravel road, soaked to the skin, covered in mud and scratches, carrying 2 bags that together weighed nearly 60 pounds, and I almost turned around. Almost. Because asking for help felt like admitting defeat, and admitting defeat felt like becoming my father, the version of my father I had believed in for 18 years, the weak one, the one who couldn't handle it, the one who ran. But I was not that man's daughter. I was the daughter of Callum Mercer, who had stayed and fought and died. And Callum Mercer had not been too proud to accept help from Malcolm Ashworth when the fight was bigger than one person could handle alone. I walked across the gravel and knocked on Frank Novak's door. It took a moment. The sound of a chair scraping back. Slow, heavy footsteps. The click of a deadbolt. The door opened and Frank Novak stood there in the yellow light, 68 years old, barrel-chested, wearing a flannel robe over a white undershirt. His gray hair mussed from sleep, his expression shifting from irritation to alarm as he took in the sight of me, a young woman, soaked, bleeding from a scratch across her forehead. Muddy, shaking, clutching a duffel bag that was far too heavy for its size. "Please," I said, and my voice cracked on the word, and I hated the sound of it, but I kept going. "I need help. I was in the Ashworth house. There were men. They came for something hidden inside. I found it first. I need somewhere to dry off and think. Just for an hour. Then I'll go." Frank Novak looked at me for a long moment, his eyes deep-set brown, framed by the deep lines of a face that had spent decades working outdoors, moved from my face to the bags, to the scratches on my hands, and back to my face. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice was low and gravelly, the voice of a man who didn't waste words. "Elena Mercer." Something changed in his expression. Not shock exactly, more like confirmation. The settling of a suspicion that had been forming for a long time, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place with a quiet, definitive click. "You look like him," Frank said softly. The rain dripped from the trailer's awning onto the gravel behind me. Somewhere in the woods, a bird called out a single clear note in the gray morning air. "You knew my father," I said. It was not a question. "I knew Callum Mercer," Frank said. "I did the plumbing work on the Ashworth house when it was built. Your father was there every day overseeing the construction. He was a good man, quiet, always had blueprints in his hand, always thinking about something nobody else could see." He paused. "When he disappeared, I knew something was wrong. Men like your father don't just leave." He stepped back from the doorway and held the door open. "Come inside, kid. You're freezing." I stepped over the threshold. The trailer was small and immaculate, the ordered space of a man who lived alone and found comfort in routine. A kitchen table with a single placemat, a coffee pot already on the smell of fresh grounds filling the air, a bookshelf lined with paperback westerns and plumbing manuals. Above the shelf, a framed photograph of a much younger Frank standing beside a woman with kind eyes and silver earrings. Frank poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking. He set one in front of me and sat down across the small table and folded his thick, scarred hands. "I don't need to know what's in those bags," he said, "and I'm not going to ask. But I need to know one thing. Are those men going to come looking for you here?" "I don't think so," I said. "They don't know who I am. They just know someone was in the house." "Then drink your coffee, warm up, and tell me what you need." What I needed was simple. I needed a vehicle. Frank's pickup truck parked outside a battered 2004 Ford F-150 with a cracked tailgate and an engine that sounded like it had emphysema but ran. "I need to borrow your truck," I said. "Just for today. I'll bring it back or I'll leave it somewhere you can find it." I know that's a lot to ask from a stranger. Frank looked at me across the table. He took a slow sip of his coffee. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first true light of dawn was breaking through the clouds, turning the sky from gray to pale gold. "Your father wasn't a stranger to me," he said, "and his daughter isn't either." He reached into the pocket of his robe and produced a single key on a plain metal ring. He slid it across the table. "Bring it back when you can," he said, "and Elena." I looked up. "Whatever you found in that house, whatever those men were after, do the right thing with it. Your father would have wanted that." I picked up the key. I finished the coffee. I stood up. "I will," I said, and I meant it in a way that I had never meant anything before in my entire life. I walked out of Frank Novak's trailer into the cold morning light, threw my bags into the bed of the Ford, climbed behind the wheel, and turned the key. The engine coughed, shuddered, and caught. I pulled onto the county road and pointed the truck east toward the city, toward the FBI field office in Philadelphia, toward the fight that my father had started 18 years ago and never got to finish. He had built the room. He had hidden the evidence. He had written the letter. Now it was my turn. I drove east toward Philadelphia with the windows down and the cold October air flooding the cab of Frank Novak's pickup truck, and for the first time in weeks, my mind was not consumed by survival. It was consumed by strategy. The duffel bag sat on the passenger seat beside me, heavy as a body. The backpack was wedged behind my seat. The red leather ledger pressed spine first against my laptop. My father's letter zipped into the interior pocket of my jacket directly over my heart. Somewhere behind me, in the gray woods surrounding the Ashworth estate, Nathan Frost and Kovac were likely still searching for the person who had escaped from behind the hidden wall. Somewhere above all of it, in his corner office or his penthouse or whatever gilded cage, a man like Victor Hargrove slept in the man who had ordered my father's murder, was waking up to begin another ordinary day. He didn't know yet. He didn't know that the ledger was gone, that the audio recording had been heard, that 18 years of buried secrets had been unearthed by the daughter of the man he had killed. He didn't know that the girl he had evicted from her apartment 6 weeks ago, the girl he had pushed onto the street with calculated precision, hoping she would drift away and disappear, had instead drifted directly into the one place in the world that held the weapons to destroy him. He would know soon, but I couldn't go to him. I couldn't go to the local police. My father's letter had been explicit about that, and the ledger confirmed it. 3 sitting judges, a former mayor's chief of staff, at least 2 precinct captains, all on Hargrove's payroll. If I walked into a Philadelphia police station with the red ledger, the evidence would vanish before the ink dried on my statement. And shortly after that, I would vanish too, the same way my father had vanished, the same way Malcolm Ashworth had vanished, quietly, permanently reclassified from person to problem to nothing. I needed a bigger hammer. I needed the federal government. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour truck stop diner about 15 miles outside the city. The lot was half full, big rigs idling in rows, their running lights glowing amber in the early morning haze. I parked the Ford between 2 semi-trailers where it couldn't be seen from the road, grabbed my bags, and walked inside. The diner was the kind of place that existed outside of time, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, formica tables worn smooth by decades of elbows, the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease hanging in the air like a permanent weather system. A few truckers sat in scattered booths, hunched over plates of eggs and hash browns, their eyes glazed with the particular fatigue of men who had driven through the night. I found a booth in the back corner facing the door. I ordered a black coffee and paid for it with $100 bill from the duffel bag, keeping the bag on the seat beside me, my hand resting on its zipper. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Donna, looked at the crisp bill, looked at my mud-caked clothes and the scratch across my forehead, and said nothing. She brought the coffee and a glass of water I hadn't asked for and left me alone. I opened my laptop. The diner's Wi-Fi was weak and unsecured, the kind of connection that loaded web pages like it was pulling them through wet concrete. But it was enough. I searched for the FBI field office in Philadelphia. I found the main switchboard number, but I didn't want a switchboard. I wanted a specific person, someone in the white-collar crime division or the public corruption unit, someone with no local ties, no history in Philadelphia politics, no connections that Hargrove's tentacles could have reached. I scrolled through the FBI's public staff directory, scanning names and titles and office assignments. Most of the agents in the Philadelphia field office had been there for years, long enough to have attended the same civic dinners and charity galas where Hargrove held court. Long enough to have shaken his hand, accepted his donations, looked the other way when rumors surfaced, and then sank back into the mud. Then I found a name that stopped my scrolling. Special Agent Sylvia Brannick, transferred to the Philadelphia field office 14 months ago from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Chicago. Before that, she had spent 6 years on a task force dismantling political corruption networks in Illinois, including a case that had sent a sitting state senator to federal prison for 12 years. She had no Philadelphia history, no local roots, no reason to owe Victor Hargrove anything. I bought a prepaid burner phone from the gas station attached to the diner. $12. I paid cash. I sat in the booth, took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, and dialed the number listed for Agent Brannick's direct extension. It rang 4 times. I almost hung up. Then the line clicked. "Brannick!" The voice was clipped professional and slightly hoarse, like a woman who had been at her desk since before dawn and was already on her 3rd cup of coffee. "My name is Elena Mercer," I said. My voice trembled on the first 2 words, but steadied by the 3rd solidifying into something harder than I knew I had in me. "I'm calling because I have evidence of a federal criminal conspiracy involving real estate fraud, political corruption, money laundering, bribery of sitting judges, and the murder of at least 2 people, one of whom was my father." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight and texture. The silence of a trained investigator recalibrating her entire morning based on 5 seconds of phone call. "I have the primary ledger documenting every transaction," I continued. "Names, dates, dollar amounts, shell company registrations. I have an audio recording of the conspiracy's leader ordering my father's assassination. And I have approximately $400,000 in cash that was hidden in a concealed room designed by my father before he was killed. The man at the center of all of it is Victor Hargrove." The silence on the other end of the line changed. I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper, rapid and urgent. "Where did you obtain this evidence?" Brannick asked, and her voice had shifted the professional detachment replaced by the focused intensity of a hunter who has just caught a scent. "From a hidden room inside the Ashworth estate on County Road 17. Malcolm Ashworth spent years compiling it. My father, Callum Mercer, designed the room. Both men were killed by Hargrove to prevent this evidence from reaching federal authorities." "And where are you now?" "A diner off I-76. I'm not coming to your office. Hargrove has people inside local law enforcement, and I don't know how far his reach extends. I'll meet you in a public place. Somewhere crowded, somewhere he can't reach." A pause. I could hear Brannick breathing, hear the calculations running behind her silence, risk assessment, jurisdictional considerations, the instinctive skepticism of an agent who had probably received 100 crank calls for every legitimate tip. 30th Street Station, she said. "Main concourse near the Amtrak departures board. 2 hours." "Bring a forensic accountant," I said. "You're going to need one." I hung up. My hand was shaking. I set the phone down on the table and pressed my palms flat against the formica and breathed until the trembling stopped. 2 hours later, I was standing in the main concourse of 30th Street Station, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a major transit hub. Commuters moved through the cavernous cathedral-ceilinged space in rivers of dark coats and rolling luggage, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The arrivals and departures board clattered overhead, its split-flap display cycling through destinations with a sound like shuffling cards. I had washed the mud off my face and hands in the diner bathroom. I had changed into the least wrinkled clothes from my duffel bag. But there was only so much you could do to disguise the fact that you were a 25-year-old woman who had spent the previous night running through the woods, hiding in a steel bunker, and sleeping in a ravine. I looked like exactly what I was, someone who had been through something that defied casual explanation. Agent Sylvia Brannick arrived alone. I spotted her before she spotted me, a tall, lean woman in her late 40s, wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt, her graying auburn hair pulled back in a severe twist. She moved through the crowd with the economical gait of someone who had spent years navigating spaces where situational awareness was a survival skill. Her eyes swept the concourse in steady arcs, cataloging faces, registering exits. She found me standing near a pillar by the Amtrak board. Her gaze moved from my face to the heavy duffel bag at my feet, to the backpack on my shoulders, and I watched her expression shift through a rapid sequence assessment, skepticism, concern, and something that might have been recognition of a kindred stubbornness. "Elena Mercer," she said. Not a question. "Agent Brannick." We sat on a bench near the windows overlooking the platform. Commuters streamed past us in both directions, creating a wall of ambient noise and movement that made our conversation functionally invisible. I unzipped my backpack and removed the red leather ledger. I set it on the bench between us. Brannick opened it with the careful, deliberate hands of someone handling a device that might detonate. Her eyes moved down the first page, the columns of dates and names and dollar amounts, and I watched her face tighten. The professional mask held, but beneath it, I could see the reaction. Recognition. The names of judges she probably knew. City officials she had likely encountered in her 14 months in Philadelphia. The scope of the corruption laid out in meticulous, undeniable detail. She turned to the second page, the third. By the fifth page, her jaw was set so tightly I could see the muscles flexing beneath her skin. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked, closing the ledger with the controlled precision of someone sealing a container of hazardous material. I told her everything. The eviction, the photograph hidden in my mother's suitcase, the Ashworth estate, the 3 weeks of living in the mansion, the hidden wall, the panic room, the murder board, the ledger, my father's letter, the audio recording on the computer. Frost and Kovac, the sledgehammer, the escape through the conservatory. I told it chronologically, without embellishment, in the flat factual tone of someone delivering a deposition rather than telling a story. Brannick listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the ledger on the bench between us. "This is the most comprehensive corruption dossier I have ever seen outside of a federal investigation," she said quietly. "If these records are authentic, and my preliminary read suggests they are, this is enough to indict a dozen people on federal charges." "They're authentic," I said. Malcolm Ashworth spent years building that case. My father died for it. Brannick looked at me. Her expression had changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something more complex respect, perhaps mixed with the pragmatic awareness that what I had just handed her was both an extraordinary gift and an enormous problem. "I need to be direct with you, Elena," she said, and the shift in her tone told me that whatever came next was going to be the part of the conversation I didn't want to hear. "You mentioned approximately $400,000 in cash. It's in the duffel bag." Her eyes moved to the bag at my feet, then back to my face. "I understand what that money means to you. Your father hid it for you. It's the only thing he was able to leave behind. And I understand that after what you've been through, the eviction, the homelessness, the weeks of living in that house, that money must feel like the only lifeline you have." She paused. I could feel the weight of what was coming, the way you can feel the pressure drop before a storm. "But here's the reality. If we're going to prosecute Victor Hargrove for the murder of your father, we need every piece of evidence that came out of that room. The ledger, the computer, the audio recording, and the cash. The money is part of the evidentiary chain. It proves that Ashworth and your father were embedded in Hargrove's financial operation. It corroborates the ledger's account of skimmed funds. Without it, the defense will argue that the ledger is fabricated, a posthumous revenge fantasy created by a disgruntled associate with no material proof." I stared at her. My fingers were resting on the strap of the duffel bag, and I could feel the dense, heavy mass of the bundled bills through the canvas. "You're asking me to give up the money. I'm telling you what the case requires. If I keep it..." Brannick's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped half a register, taking on the careful weight of a person who was about to deliver news that would rearrange someone's life. "If you keep it and we proceed without it, the prosecution's case for murder becomes significantly weaker. We can likely get Hargrove on racketeering, fraud, and bribery based on the ledger alone. Those carry serious sentences. But the murder charge, the charge for your father's death, requires the most airtight evidentiary package we can assemble. Every piece matters, every link in the chain needs to hold." She let that settle. "And if we proceed with the prosecution, and it later comes to light that you withheld physical evidence, which it very likely would given the thoroughness of federal discovery, you would be exposed to charges of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and possession of proceeds from illegal activity. I would not be able to protect you from that." The noise of the train station continued around us, the clatter of the departures board, the rumble of trains, the murmur of 1,000 strangers going about their lives, oblivious to the fact that a 25-year-old woman sitting on a bench near the Amtrak board was being asked to choose between financial survival and justice for her murdered father. I looked down at the duffel bag. $400,000. Enough to buy a house. Enough to never sleep in a car again. Never scavenge bottles from a ditch. Never stand in a public library bathroom at 7 in the morning trying to wash her face quickly enough that no one would notice she was homeless. enough to erase the last 2 months of my life and start over as someone who had never been broken. My father had stolen that money for me. He had said so in his letter. It was the only inheritance he could leave stained and imperfect, but real. Take it, he had written. Take the money. But he had also written something else. Something that I had read in the dim blue light of a dead man's computer screen, holding a letter that smelled like old paper and sealed air. Destroy them. Not take the money and run. Not save yourself and forget the rest. Destroy them. Every man whose name appears in that book. My father had given me 2 things in that room. The money was one. The mission was the other. And sitting on that bench in 30th Street Station, I understood with sudden complete clarity that they were mutually exclusive. I could keep the money or I could finish what he started. I could not do both. I thought about my mother, Catherine Mercer, who had hidden a photograph in the lining of a suitcase and carried the secret of her husband's fate for 9 years before the cancer took her. She could have told me the truth. She could have sent me to the Ashworth house when I was 16, when I was 18, when I was 20. But she had waited. She had sealed the information away and trusted that it would find me when the time was right, when I was strong enough and desperate enough and angry enough to do something with it. She had trusted me to make the right choice. I thought about my father, Callum Mercer, who had stood in front of a Victorian mansion with blueprints under his arm and built a room that would outlast him by 2 decades, who had chosen truth over safety and paid for it with his life, who had written a letter to a 7-year-old daughter he would never see again and hidden it behind a wall, and hoped with the desperate, irrational faith of a father who loved his child beyond reason, that somehow, someday, she would find it. He had trusted me to make the right choice. I looked up at Agent Brannick. Take it, I said. I pushed the duffel bag across the bench toward her with both hands. The weight of it slid across the wood with a low, heavy scrape. Take all of it. The money, the ledger, the letter, the audio file, everything. I want him prosecuted for murder. I want him prosecuted for killing my father. And I want it to stick. Whatever that requires, you have it. Brannick looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, a single measured dip of her chin that carried more weight than any words could have. You're doing the right thing, she said. I know, I said. That's why it hurts. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. Agent Brannick moved fast. Within hours of our meeting, she had assembled a task force, 12 agents from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, supplemented by forensic accountants from the Financial Crimes Division, and a team of federal prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The ledger was authenticated by a handwriting analyst who compared Ashworth's entries to samples obtained from his personal documents stored in county records. The audio file was extracted from the computer's hard drive by a digital forensics team that Brannick dispatched to the Ashworth estate before Hargrove's demolition crew could arrive. That was a race measured in minutes. Brannick told me later that when the FBI's evidence recovery team arrived at the property at 4:47 in the morning, they found a convoy of construction vehicles already staged on the access road, their engines idling, their operators waiting for the 6 a.m. go-ahead from Hargrove's office. The FBI seized the property under an emergency federal warrant and turned the construction crew away. The foreman made a phone call. Somewhere in Philadelphia, Victor Hargrove's morning was about to take a turn he had spent 2 decades making sure would never happen. I spent those 48 hours in a safe house, a nondescript 2-bedroom apartment in a federal building in Center City that smelled like cleaning solution and stale air. Brannick assigned a protective detail, 2 agents who sat in the living room and checked the hallway every 30 minutes and spoke to each other in the low-clipped shorthand of people who were professionally calm in situations that would terrify ordinary humans. I sat on the bed in the back bedroom and stared at the wall and did not sleep. I kept thinking about Frost's voice in the Ashworth study. This wall is wrong. The dimensions don't add up. He had been inches away from finding me. If Kovac had swung the sledgehammer 3 more times, if the steel plate had buckled, if I had waited 30 more seconds to turn the iron wheel, I would be dead. Or worse, I would have been delivered to Victor Hargrove alive and aware, carrying the only evidence that connected him to my father's murder. I thought about Frank Novak standing at the gate of the Ashworth estate every week with his $5 gas station carnations, mourning a man the rest of the world had forgotten. I owed him a truck and an explanation and more gratitude than I knew how to express. And I thought about my father. Not the version of him I had carried for 18 years, the hollow man, the coward, the architect who couldn't build a family that lasted. I thought about the real Callum Mercer, the man who had sat in a steel room that he had designed with his own hands and written a letter to a daughter he knew he would never see grow up. The man who had chosen to fight, even though fighting meant dying. I understood something about him that I hadn't understood before. He hadn't hidden the money for me because he wanted me to be comfortable. He had hidden it because he wanted me to have a choice. The choice he never got. The choice between running and fighting, between safety and justice, between the easy path and the right one. And I had chosen. On the morning of the second day, Agent Brannick called me from the field. "We're executing the warrants in 90 minutes, she said. Her voice was tight with controlled adrenaline. Multiple simultaneous raids. Hargrove's corporate headquarters, his residence, and 3 properties identified in the ledger as cash storage locations. We have arrest warrants for Hargrove Frost and 6 others named in the ledger. The U.S. Attorney has approved a 22-count indictment." 22, I repeated. Racketeering, federal tax fraud, wire fraud, bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit murder. 2 counts. She paused. 1 for Callum Mercer, 1 for Malcolm Ashworth. The forensic pathologist reviewed Ashworth's death certificate and autopsy records overnight. The original coroner, who incidentally is also named in the ledger, ruled cardiac arrest. The FBI's pathologist found evidence consistent with acute digitalis poisoning. Ashworth was murdered, Elena, your father and his friend. We're charging Hargrove with both. I sat on the edge of the bed in the safe house and pressed the phone against my ear, and I did not speak for a long moment because my throat had closed around a knot of emotion so dense it felt like swallowing a fist. Thank you, I finally managed. Don't thank me, Brannick said. Thank your father. He built the case. I'm just serving the papers. I watched it happen on television. Brannick had arranged for me to remain in the safe house during the raids. Too dangerous, she said, for me to be anywhere near the operation. So I sat on the worn sofa in the living room of a federal apartment and watched it unfold on a 12-year-old flat-screen television tuned to the local news. The coverage broke into regular programming just after 9 in the morning. The anchor's voice carried the barely suppressed excitement of a journalist who understood they were narrating history. We are going live now to the headquarters of Hargrove Development Group in Center City, Philadelphia, where FBI tactical teams have arrived to execute what we are being told are federal arrest warrants. The aerial footage showed it all. Black SUVs parked in a ring around the glass and steel office tower. Agents in tactical vests and FBI windbreakers moving through the lobby. Employees streaming out of the building with their hands visible, their faces caught between confusion and fear. Then the front doors opened and Victor Hargrove walked out. He was wearing a charcoal suit. No tie. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, the first time I had ever seen him look less than perfectly composed. His hands were behind his back, secured in steel handcuffs that caught the morning sunlight and flashed like mirrors. An agent held each arm. A third walked behind him, one hand resting on the holstered weapon at his hip. Hargrove's face was a mask. Not the controlled, confident mask he had worn in my doorway 6 weeks ago. This was different. This was the mask of a man who was watching the architecture of his life collapse in real time, floor by floor, beam by beam, the structural integrity failing under a weight. It was never designed to bear the weight of the truth. Behind him, escorted by 2 more agents, came Nathan Frost. Frost was not wearing a mask. His expression was pure, undisguised fury. The cornered rage of a man who had spent his career operating in shadows and was now being dragged into sunlight he couldn't escape. He had a cut above his left eye, a souvenir of what the news would later describe as brief resistance during the arrest. The news anchor's voice continued breathless and precise. Real estate developer Victor Hargrove has been taken into federal custody this morning on what sources describe as a sweeping 22-count indictment, including racketeering, tax fraud, bribery of public officials, and in a stunning development, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. I picked up the remote and turned the television off. The apartment fell silent. The 2 agents in the living room glanced at me, their expressions carefully neutral. Outside the window, the city moved and breathed and continued indifferent to the fact that one of its most powerful men had just been pulled from his throne and marched into a federal holding cell. I sat in the silence, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time, possibly ever. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter and deeper than either of those things. It was the sensation of a weight being lifted not from my shoulders, but from my chest, from the place where I had carried my father's absence like a stone for 18 years. The stone was gone, not because the loss was gone, but because the lie was gone, the lie that he had chosen to leave, the lie that he hadn't loved me enough to stay, the lie that I had built my entire identity around brick by furious brick until it became a wall so high I couldn't see over it. The wall was down now, and on the other side was grief. Yes, enormous and real and permanent, but also clarity, also truth, also the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. In the weeks that followed, the scope of the investigation expanded far beyond what even Agent Brannick had anticipated. The red ledger combined with the digital files recovered from the Ashworth estate's hidden computer provided the FBI with a comprehensive map of corruption that extended into every layer of Philadelphia's civic infrastructure. 14 individuals were indicted in the initial sweep: judges, zoning officials, building inspectors, a former deputy mayor, and the county coroner who had falsified Malcolm Ashworth's death certificate. Victor Hargrove was denied bail. The federal prosecutor argued successfully that a man with Hargrove's resources and international financial connections represented an extreme flight risk. He was held in a federal detention facility pending trial. His assets frozen, his properties seized, his empire dismantled with the methodical thoroughness of a demolition crew taking apart a building that had been condemned. Nathan Frost cooperated. Faced with the audio recording and the ledger's meticulous documentation, Frost negotiated a plea agreement that included full testimony against Hargrove in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony filled in the gaps that the ledger couldn't: the operational details, the logistics of intimidation, the mechanisms by which Hargrove maintained control over his network of corrupted officials. And then came the revelation that I was not expecting. It arrived 3 weeks after the raids in a phone call from Agent Brannick. "Elena, we need to talk about Preston Delaney." The name hit me like a slap. Preston Delaney, my former boss, the man in the Italian loafers and the pearl-white Porsche who had laid me off from Whitmore Creative Partners on a Friday afternoon and sent me spiraling into the chain of events that led to the Ashworth house. "What about him?" I asked, and even as I asked, I felt the floor beneath my understanding shift the way it had shifted in the hidden room when I saw my father's photograph on the murder board. "His name appears in the ledger," Brannick said. "Page 47, a payment of $35,000 from one of Hargrove's shell companies to Whitmore Creative Partners dated 6 weeks before your termination." The memo line on the wire transfer reads,
Consulting fee personnel matter.
I said nothing. My hand tightened around the phone. We interviewed Delaney yesterday, Brannick continued, under oath. He confirmed that Hargrove contacted him directly and offered the payment in exchange for terminating your employment. The story about the lost client was real. The firm was struggling, but the decision to include you in the layoffs was not based on performance or seniority. It was specifically directed. Hargrove told Delaney to fire you. The room tilted. I sat down. Hargrove wanted you destabilized, Brannick said, and her voice was careful now, the voice of someone delivering information that they know will detonate inside the listener's chest. He wanted you to lose your income, fall behind on rent, and be evicted from his property. He was engineering your removal from the city. He knew who you were, Elena. He knew you were Callum Mercer's daughter. And he was afraid that as long as you remained in Philadelphia, there was a chance, however small, that you would eventually stumble onto the truth about your father. I closed my eyes. Every piece fell into place. The lost job, the eviction, the cold, deliberate way Hargrove had stood in my doorway and asked my full legal name. The twitch in his eye when I said Mercer. None of it was random. None of it was the impersonal machinery of economic hardship grinding down another unlucky young person. It was targeted. It was personal. It was a campaign of destruction aimed at one specific woman for one specific reason. Victor Hargrove had tried to bury me. Not with a bullet the way he had buried my father. With poverty, with homelessness, with the slow grinding erasure of a life dismantled piece by piece until there was nothing left, and the person who had once lived it simply drifted away, too broken and too exhausted to ever come back. And it had almost worked. If I hadn't found the photograph in my mother's suitcase, if I hadn't remembered the Ashworth estate, if my father hadn't built a room that would outlast him by 18 years, if Malcolm Ashworth hadn't spent the last 3 years of his life compiling evidence with the obsessive dedication of a man who knew he was running out of time. If any single link in that chain had broken, I would have disappeared. Exactly the way Hargrove planned. But the chain held. Every link, every piece. My father's architecture, my mother's hidden photograph, Ashworth's ledger, Frank Novak's truck. My own stubborn, furious refusal to stop moving forward even when moving forward meant crawling through the dark on my hands and knees. The chain held, and instead of burying me, it pulled me through. Preston Delaney was indicted on charges of conspiracy and wire fraud. He pleaded guilty. In his allocution, he told the court that he had known what he was doing was wrong, that he had felt sick about it, that he had tried to tell himself it was just business. The judge gave him 18 months in a minimum security facility. I did not attend the sentencing. I had already spent too many hours of my life in rooms defined by Preston Delaney's decisions. 6 months after the raids, the city of Philadelphia was unrecognizable. The corruption sweep triggered by the Ashworth ledger had torn through the civic fabric like a scalpel through infected tissue, cutting away the rot that had been growing beneath the surface for over 2 decades. A new mayor had been elected on a reform platform. 3 judicial seats had been vacated and filled through emergency appointment. The housing authority had been restructured, and hundreds of families in Hargrove's former properties were being relocated to safe, code-compliant housing, while his buildings were inspected and in many cases condemned. Victor Hargrove sat in a federal detention center awaiting trial on 22 counts. His legal team had filed motion after motion, attempting to suppress the ledger challenge. The chain of custody argue that the hidden room constituted an illegal search. Every motion was denied. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation meticulous, the audio recording devastating. Frost's testimony sealed it. On the stand, in a closed preliminary hearing, he described in detail how Hargrove had ordered the elimination of Callum Mercer. He described the meeting, the instructions, the payment to the contractor who carried it out. He described how 3 years later, when Hargrove learned that Ashworth was continuing to compile evidence, a second order was given. A different method, digitalis, administered through Ashworth's evening tea by a housekeeper who had been placed in the home by one of Hargrove's associates. The housekeeper had since left the country, but Frost's testimony, combined with the revised forensic pathology report and the coroner's own confession, built a murder case so solid that Hargrove's attorneys stopped trying to fight it and began negotiating terms. There would be no negotiation. The U.S. attorney was seeking life without parole. As for me, Agent Brannick had kept her word. The money, the $400,000 that I had surrendered on a bench in 30th Street Station, was cataloged, documented, and entered into evidence. It corroborated the ledger's records of skimmed funds. It proved that Callum Mercer had been embedded in Hargrove's operation and had been accumulating resources for a planned escape that never came. It was one more link in the chain that would put Victor Hargrove away for the rest of his natural life. I never saw that money again. But I didn't need it, because 6 weeks after the indictment, I received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice informing me that I had been approved for a federal whistleblower award under the provisions of the False Claims Act. The award was calculated as a percentage of the financial penalties and asset forfeitures resulting from the prosecution, and given the scale of Hargrove's fraud, the number was substantial. Not $400,000, but enough to buy a small, clean house on the coast of Maine in a town where the air smelled like salt and pine, and the ocean was visible from the kitchen window. Enough to furnish it simply comfortably without extravagance. Enough to start a life that was built not on dirty money hidden in vacuum-sealed bags, but on a federal check issued in recognition of a citizen who had brought evidence of corruption to the proper authorities at significant personal risk. Clean money, earned money, money that didn't carry the weight of my father's guilt or Victor Hargrove's crimes. The first thing I did with the house was hang my mother's photograph in the kitchen. Catherine Mercer in her yellow sundress, laughing at something off-camera, young and alive and beautiful. I hung it where the morning sunlight would hit it, so that every day when I made my coffee, I would see her face illuminated in gold. The second thing I did was drive to a cemetery on a hill overlooking the ocean. My father had no grave. There had been no body to bury, no funeral to attend, no closure of any kind. For 18 years, Callum Mercer had existed in a liminal state, not confirmed dead, not known to be alive, just absent, a blank space in the world shaped like a man. I bought a headstone, simple gray granite, polished smooth. I had it placed on the hillside where the grass was green, and the wind came off the water, and the sky was enormous and open and free. The inscription read, Callum Mercer. He built the truth into the walls. I stood in front of that headstone on a clear October afternoon, 1 year to the week after I had been evicted from my apartment, and I spoke to my father for the first time in 18 years. I told him I was sorry. Sorry for the anger. Sorry for the years of believing the worst about him. Sorry for the version of him I had constructed in my mind. The coward, the quitter, the man who chose himself over his family, and the way I had used that version as a shield against the vulnerability of loving someone who wasn't there. I told him I understood now, that I understood the choice he had made and the courage it required and the price it extracted. That I understood he hadn't left because he was weak. He had stayed because he was strong, and the strength had cost him everything. I told him I had finished what he started, that Victor Hargrove was in a cell, that the ledger had done exactly what it was designed to do, that Malcolm Ashworth's years of solitary, desperate work had not been in vain. And I told him I forgave him, not for leaving he hadn't left, for not finding another way, for not running with us, grabbing my mother and me in the middle of the night and driving until the road ran out and starting over somewhere Hargrove couldn't reach. I knew it was irrational. I knew there probably was no other way. But I was his daughter, and I was standing at his grave, and I needed to say it out loud so that I could set it down and walk away lighter than I came. The wind blew off the ocean. The grass bent. The headstone stood solid and clean against the sky. I drove back through the countryside, and on the way I made a stop. Frank Novak's trailer looked the same pale blue with rust streaks, firewood stacked in neat rows, the vegetable garden dormant now in the autumn cold. I parked the Ford F-150 in the gravel drive. I had held on to it for months, maintaining it, replacing the worn brake pads, filling the tank before every return. It ran better now than it had in years. Frank came out when he heard the engine. He stood on the cinder block steps in front of his door, wearing the same canvas work jacket and faded cap, and he watched me climb out of the truck with a paper bag in my hand. "Brought your truck back," I said. "Looks like you took better care of it than I did," he said. I held up the paper bag. "And coffee, and pie, apple,
from the bakery in town.
We sat at his small kitchen table, the same table where I had sat 6 months ago, soaked and terrified and clutching a bag of stolen cash. The trailer was warm. The coffee was strong. The pie was good. Frank ate slowly, methodically, the way a man eats when he has lived alone long enough to turn every meal into a small, private ritual. I read about Hargrove in the paper, he said after a while. Saw the whole thing, the arrests, the indictments. They mentioned your father by name, said he was a victim. He was, I said, but he was more than that. He was the reason any of it came to light. Frank nodded. He looked out the window at the trees, the bare branches scratching against the gray sky. I used to wonder, he said quietly. After Callum disappeared, after Malcolm died, I used to stand at that gate and wonder if anyone would ever find out what really happened. If the truth was in there somewhere, locked up in those walls waiting. He turned back to me. I'm glad it was you. I'm glad you opened your door, I said. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a shift in the lines around his eyes. But it was real, and it was warm, and it was enough. I left Frank Novak's trailer in the late afternoon as the sun was beginning to drop toward the tree line. I didn't take the truck. I had bought a car of my own, nothing fancy, a reliable sedan with good mileage and a heater that worked. I left the Ford's keys on Frank's kitchen table with a note that read, "She's all yours. Thank you for everything." I drove home to Maine. The road unwound ahead of me in long, gentle curves through forests that were shedding their last autumn leaves, the maples burning orange and red against the deepening blue of the sky. I drove with the window cracked and the cold air streaming in, carrying the smell of wood smoke and wet earth and the faint, distant salt of the ocean. When I got home, I made a cup of coffee and sat at my desk by the kitchen window. My laptop was open, and on the screen was a project I had been working on for the past 2 weeks, a logo design for a nonprofit organization that provided emergency housing for people experiencing homelessness in rural communities. They couldn't pay much. I didn't need much. The logo was simple. A roofline over an open door, a hand reaching through the threshold. Clean lines, no clutter. The kind of design my father would have appreciated, functional, honest, built to last. I looked up from the screen and out the window. The ocean was a dark blue line on the horizon, flat and steady. The kind of view that doesn't demand anything from you, that simply exists and lets you exist alongside it. I thought about the girl who had sat in a broken Honda Civic in a supermarket parking lot, clutching a can of pepper spray, with $14 in her pocket, and nothing ahead of her but darkness. I thought about the girl who had crawled through a cellar window into a dead man's house, and slept on velvet curtains and eaten peanut butter with her fingers in the dark. I thought about the girl who had stood in a steel room behind a hidden wall and held a letter from a father she thought had thrown her away, and learned in a single devastating moment that everything she believed about her life was wrong. That girl was me. She would always be me, But she was not all of me, not anymore. Victor Hargrove had tried to bury me beneath eviction notices and poverty and the systematic dismantling of everything I had. He thought he could engineer my disappearance the way he engineered his real estate deals through leverage and pressure and the cold mathematics of power applied to vulnerability. But he made a mistake. The oldest mistake in the book. He underestimated a woman with nothing left to lose, and he forgot the most fundamental law of architecture, the one my father understood better than anyone. The things you try to hide behind walls don't stay hidden forever. The walls come down. The truth comes out. And the structures that are built on lies eventually collapse under their own weight. No matter how carefully they were designed, no matter how much money was spent to keep them standing. My father built the truth into the walls of the Ashworth estate. My mother hid the map in the lining of a suitcase. Malcolm Ashworth spent the last 3 years of his life compiling evidence that he sealed behind a door he knew he would never open again. Frank Novak laid flowers at a gate every week for a decade, keeping faith with the dead man, because he believed that some things are worth remembering, even when the world wants to forget. And I broke homeless, 25, and furious walked into that house with nothing and walked out with everything. Not the money. I gave that away. The truth. I kept that. It turns out the truth is heavier than cash, but easier to carry. And it lasts longer than anything you can build with bricks or steel or dirty money. It lasts forever. And it fits perfectly behind a hollow wall.